Pansy Craze was an LGBTQ rights movement in the early 1900s in hubs of big cities such as New York, Harlem, Paris, Chicago, Berlin, and LA. Drag queens experienced a surge in popularity, with drag clubs becoming far more prominent and LGBTQ nightlife rising to new heights. Starting with the presence of drag queens and other members of the LGBTQ community at Harlem masquerade balls, the era of drag clubs and sexual expression flourished. With the general growth of underground nightlife and clubs in the U.S. due to illegal activity following Prohibition, formerly taboo topics and activities had the opportunity to blossom. This also took form in a larger consciousness of LGBTQ rights issues worldwide. With the growing popularity of drag clubs, the Pansy Craze marks an important beginning of gay nightlife. This form of expression served to move the gay rights movement forward as a whole, and it allowed people in this community to find their voice and break oppressive silence.
The Pansy Craze was largely inspired by masquerade balls in Harlem in 1869. These balls were very queer-friendly, and they had many drag performers present. This inspired the creation of more queer-friendly bars around the U.S. It was then many more decades before the Pansy Craze really began to take off. In 1919, Prohibition was enacted. This triggered the establishment of many black market bars, and drag queens began to perform at those. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Pansy Craze was at its height, with many queer people performing in nightlife around the U.S., giving drag performances or singing songs about LGBTQ plus rights and experiences.
Drag queens and other queer performers would go to LGBTQ-friendly bars and nightclubs around major cities and perform in them. Many people chose to dress up in drag, and a lot of performers involved singing songs about LGBTQ rights. For example, Das Lila Lied, the Lavender song, was considered a gay anthem at the time, so this was a very common song to hear at Pansy Craze events. The movement was not exclusive to gay men, and many different types of people, including allies, would show up to Pansy Craze events to show support. Leaders of the Pansy Craze, such as Jean Malin and Carl Norman, wanted the event to get a lot of press covered so more people would celebrate the LGBTQ community. Newspapers frequently wrote about the Pansy Craze, with some sources discussing it positively and others negatively.
The movement began to die down in 1931 when drag queen Carol Norman was caught during a police raid at Manhattan's Pansy Club. The police shut down the performance and began to guard nightlife hotspots to make sure drag queens couldn't get in. In 1933, Jean Malin died, signaling the end of the movement, as one of the primary figures of the movement was no longer present. Also in 1933, Prohibition was repealed. When the laws were repealed, black market bars, the places where Pansy Craze was centered, were no longer needed, and new laws stated that alcohol could only be served in places that were orderly, and LGBTQ nightlife and activities were not included in that.
Jean Malin, also known by stage names Imogene Wilson and Jean Malin spelled with a J, was an American actor, master of ceremonies, and drag performer during the Pansy Craze. He was one of the first openly gay performers during the Pansy Craze, considered the queen of the Pansy Craze. He primarily worked in New York in the early 1930s. He was known for wearing tuxedos instead of dresses, which was unlike other drag queens at the time. He chose to do this to not impersonate women, but instead to appear as flamboyant, effeminate, and openly gay male wearing a tuxedo. Malin moved on stage, and to the audience members, he was elegant, witty, wisecracking master of ceremonies, affecting a broad, exaggerated, twisting image associated with the pansy acts that followed. In doing so, Malin and other performers, such as Carl Norman and Ray Bourbon, ignited a Pansy Craze in New York's speakeasies, and later in other cities as well. At one point, he was the highest paid nightclub entertainer in New York.
Malin was born Victor Eugene James Malinowski in Brooklyn, New York on June 30th, 1908. As a teenager, he was already winning prizes for his costumes at the elaborate Manhattan drag balls of the 1920s. By his late teens, Malin had worked as a chorus boy in several Broadway shows, including Princess Flavor, Miami, and Sisters of the Chorus. Around the same period, Malin worked at several Greenwich Village clubs as a drag performer, most notably the Rubaiyat. One theatrical production, Broadway Brevities, declared the Pansies hailed Malin as their queen, and Vanity Fair magazine published a caricature of the celebrated Malin in 1931. After headlining numerous New York clubs, Malin took his act to Boston and ultimately, in the fall of 1932, to the West Coast, where he was employed at popular nightclubs. He also performed at a club that bore his name. While in Hollywood, he appeared in 2 films, Arizona to Broadway and the Joan Crawford vehicle Dancing Lady. Malin also recorded at least 2 songs, I'd Rather Be Spanish Than Mannish, and That's What's the Matter with Me.
I can't make up my mind. I don't know whether I'm Mr.
Despite being gay, Malin married former showgirl Lucille Hyman in New York City in January 1931. Malin and Hyman had known each other from his days performing in drag at the Rubaiyat. Malin filed for divorce in Mexico in November 1932. At the time of his death, the couple were still married. In the early hours of August 10, 1933, Malin was involved in a fatal automobile accident. He had just performed a farewell performance at the Ship Cafe in Venice, Los Angeles.
Gladys Bentley was an American singer, performer, and pianist during the 1920s and 30s. She performed in known gay clubs and speakeasies alongside drag performers dressed in men's clothes, including the signature tailcoat and top hat. Bentley was very famous at the time and recorded many songs that were popular. Gladys Bentley was born on August 12, 1907, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Bentley moved from Philadelphia to Harlem in 1925 at the age of 16. She had heard that Harry Hansberry's Claim House, one of the city's most notorious gay speakeasies, needed a male pianist. This is when she began performing in men's attire, which consisted of white full dress shirts, stiff collars, small bow ties, Oxfords, short Eton jackets, and hair cut straight back. She perfected her act and became popular and successful. She sang loud, and her vocal style was deep and booming, sometimes using a growling effect and imitations of a horn. She mostly sang in a deep, low range, but also reached high notes. Bentley's performances appealed to black, white, gay, and straight audiences alike, and many celebrities attended her shows. On the decline of the Harlem speakeasies, with the repeal of Prohibition, she relocated to Southern California. She tried to continue her musical career by playing in a number of gay night spots, but did not achieve as much success as she had had in the past. As times progressed and federal laws continued to change, there became a point where Bentley had to carry special permits to allow her to perform in men's clothing. She was frequently harassed for wearing men's clothing. Bentley was openly lesbian early in her career, but during the McCarthy era, she started wearing dresses and got married. Bentley also studied to be a minister, claiming to have been cured by taking female hormones and having undergone an operation, which was her supposed cure for homosexuality.
In all, the Pansy Craze can be considered a success for the fight for LGBTQ rights. With drag shows and queer nightlife becoming more prominent with this movement, LGBTQ people had a place to come together, and LGBTQ people and queer life obtained media coverage and became a more present part of society. While the Pansy Craze wasn't as successful as other events, it was a step forward for the LGBTQ rights movement. When you analyze it through the lens of change over time, one of the historical 5 C's, you can see a clear change in awareness of LGBTQ rights issues as a result of the Pansy Craze.